Welcome to the RMP reading series. I am here with Kendall A Bell, and we are here to talk about his collection Currents and the other things that are current with Kendall. Kendall Bell is a poet and publisher living in southern New Jersey. He's authored three full-length collections: The Roads Don't Love You, The Forced Hush of Quiet, and The Shallows, along with 3 dozen chapbooks. He's the founder of Chanterelle's Notebook, a literary e-zine, Poetry Tempest, a bi-monthly reading series, and he's the publisher slash editor of Maverick Duck Press. He has been nominated for Sundress Publications Best of the Net Collection 7 times. For more information, visit www.kendallabell.com. Kendall, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So, could you please start us off with a poem?
Sure. I will read the last poem in Currents. It's called Halo Butterfly. Evolution is painful, is the slap of rejection, the body hurt, the empty feeling of sitting alone at a table. Goodbye hangs in the air like a curse. Your thin hands hold a mirror, hold a reflection you've never squinted at in disgust. Now the mask rests on the top of your vanity, stretches farther away, becomes the cicada shell left behind on the bark of a tree. Once your depth was ankle deep, the frosting carefully piped with perfection, a cascade of red framing a flourless cake. In its wake, your metamorphosis into a sister, into fullness of heart.
Thank you. Um, how do you feel about change?
Change?
Yeah, like I've
Um,
wanted to ask you this question for so long since we started working on your book.
hmm, I could be very resistant to change. I've learned to be a little better. I mean, I think some of my coworkers, past managers and whatnot, would probably say, I don't think he's going to go for this. So I have to see something worth changing for in whatever the situation is. Otherwise, I'm just not going to do that.
Yeah, yeah. And so in this poem, is the cicada shell left behind good thing or a bad thing, or does it? I mean, I guess that's kind of a
It's a
binary
good
answer.
thing. It's a good thing.
Okay, okay,
It's
okay.
in particular in with that poem, it's the person that she was isn't who she really wanted to be deep down. So for her, it's a good thing.
Yeah. How how did you go about putting this collection together? What were your considerations when you started? Because you've done okay, so you've done like a million chapbooks, and not just you've published an obscene amount of chapbooks, and you've published other people's chapbooks a whole bunch, and I imagine you have to have it down to an art form, especially when it comes to poetry selection, because you also write a lot. You just came off of an 8 month period of writing every single day for most of this year. So when you're curating a collection, what do you look for, and then what did you look for this book?
Oh, for what the very first thing is cohesiveness. They have to make sense together. If I remember when I first started putting together chapbooks, when I didn't know a damn thing about it so long ago, and I'm just thinking now, what was I thinking of with some of these things? It's just weird. It's like I wanted to get the stuff out there, but they don't necessarily gel the way they should. Variety can be good, but they still have to have some kind of cohesion. They still have to make sense together. So, I mean, no, a whole collection doesn't have to be all miserable, even though I do that sometimes. I might have or four that are pretty freaking dark, especially this last one I just put out. How does it end? Is really bleak to the point where my poet friend and good friend Charles Joseph said, "I know you have other emotions," and
Oh, that's a diagnosis.
yeah, he's like, "The work is really sound. It's really good, but this is really dark. Not everybody's going to connect with that." I was like, "The right people will."
Right. Yeah, your ideal reader will.
I mean, that's where I was, you know, when that stuff came to be. And that manuscript was actually declined by Bottle Cap Press.
Okay. Gotcha.
So,
When you were putting together currents, what were you feeling?
um, it's funny because all the poems in Currents come from one specific month, which almost never happens. But they were all poems that I had written in 2021 for this one month. And I'm looking at them and they all started to make sense together. And I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, well, there's also a good variety in there too, where there's stuff about relationships, but there's also stuff about friendships and even like a mentoring and old friendships. There's a poem in there, bleak is our brand.
I love that. I love that piece. That's a good one.
That's sort of based on a friendship, a long-standing friendship with a poet, Nicole Blackman, and we were talking about my stuff and everything. I was like, "You sure you want me to send this to you, Nicole? Because it's pretty freaking bleak." And she's like, "Well, bleak is our brand," and that stayed with me, and I wrote that poem.
So what's that's the one with the jar of fire, the image with the jar of fireflies, right? I think it
I
is.
believe so.
There. Dun, 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 dun,
I
dun.
want to pull that up now.
Um, yeah, firewood bodies left out in too many downpours. A jar of fireflies left capped in some backyard, banging against the glass.
Yep.
Yeah, I some of this book is about moving forward, which is why I think that the title is so apt. But there's so much about like breaking relationships and being isolated, but then also coming together. I like the in a very very esoteric sense that I think only maybe makes sense in my own head. I thought a lot about chemistry, about like reactions. Like I saw them as like chemical reactions of like molecules like attracting and then splitting apart. Um,
It went
how
very dark to light.
you well, yeah. Well, there are some dark poems in there. I
Oh
think
yeah, the title poem is dark as hell, and that was a poem I wrote after Naya Rivera passed, the actress.
uh,
So it was for her, especially that whole situation. It was just awful. I mean, I don't know if you know anything about that.
I don't. I was actually going to ask you to elaborate because I don't know.
Naya Rivera was she was on the show Glee. I used to actually watch Glee until it got unwatchable. But
Okay.
Naya Rivera's character was Santana, and Santana actually had an evolution on the show as well, where she you know came out eventually to her best friend and admitted how much she really meant to her. She was a really good actress, and she was out on a boat on a lake in California, I believe it was, with her son, who was like really young, like four, maybe
Mm.
five. And no one knows how it happened or whatever, but she ended up in the water and lost. And they found him in the boat by himself.
Holy shit.
And there was this exhaustive search. And days later, she surfaced.
Man.
And I don't know what her son actually saw, during the whole ordeal, but I can imagine it's something that he's not going to forget.
How old was he?
I think he was 4 or 5 when it happened.
Yeah. So young enough that old enough there'll be some trauma.
Yeah. Yeah.
Young enough, hopefully he forgets most of it. God,
Hopefully.
hopefully. Yeah. Okay. So why her story then?
Um, it just sort of stuck with me. I mean, I always liked her. I always thought, she'd been through some personal issues also. I know she was separated from her husband who she had her son with. And she'd been out of the public eye for a little while, and then that is what ended up putting her back in the public eye. And I hadn't thought about her for a while, and I was just like, wait, what's going on with Naya Rivera? And it was that. So it was kind of like, being invested in her as an actress and her character at the time when I was actually watching the show, and then just, I don't know, the story of it just, I don't know, it struck a chord.
Yeah, no, I think that's a that's a good a reason to write a poem as any. I mean, I've noticed that I have a hard time relating to people I haven't talked to in a while, and that's something that I never used to struggle with. Like I could see a friend from 15 years ago and kind of snap back into it. Um, but I've had a harder and harder time doing that. And my most recent gut reaction, reason I'm telling this story is I talked to a friend I hadn't talked to in like 10 years. He lives in New York now, and he's an actor and he's doing his own thing out there. And I went to college with him and his long term partner, and we were talking on the phone, and it my first reaction when I hung up was like, I really want to write a poem about his life. And I went and I wrote one, and I don't think I'm gonna do anything with it. It's not a really good poem, unfortunately for him or me or who, I don't know. It's nobody's loss really, but I don't know. Do you ever get that where you're like you run into something, because I think it's not exactly the same scenario, but it's something that is had an imprint for whatever reason that came back after a long period of time, and I worry that the only way I can relate to things is writing about them now. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah. That is more than once. More than once it's happened with people who I haven't seen in a long time. And, even if we just exchange, briefly online or something, and then all of a sudden I get this flood of stuff from the past, and it makes me revisit that. And then I end up writing something because that's what I do. I just end up writing something,
Where does that
you know.
impulse come from? Why do we have it? I want I want answers, damn it.
I don't know. I don't know.
Like,
I don't think it's a lizard brain thing, but
I think it is too. And like I try to identify it sometimes. I'm like, you know, another time that I have it is when I'm having a really good day with the kids, and I'm out, like maybe it's like a holiday or something, or we go someplace. Like we go to the same apple orchard every year. It's called Patterson's Fruit Farm. It's in northern Ohio, and I'll be having a good day with them, and then my first impulse is to write it down, and then I try to think, why am I having this thought? And sometimes it's like, oh, I want it to be recorded in perpetuity, even though it's not etched in stone. It's not. It's going to be a digital file that may or may not be excavated whenever
yeah,
I
yeah.
die. You know, like, so why do we have it? I don't understand.
compulsion. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, I had, again, to bring up my friend Charles Joseph. I always tell him, at some point I'm going to have to give you the password to my Dropbox in case I just drop dead or something, and maybe you'll find something worth keeping in this, and you could publish all this shit. Because he's always like, you have like all these freaking poems and you barely do anything with them, and blah blah blah. And I'm just like, yeah.
Do you do a lot of literary magazines, like publishing in them?
Not as much as I used to.
Okay.
And again, sometimes it's just kind of because the landscape changes so much,
Mm.
because lit mags have such a small shelf life, it seems, these days, except for Chanterelle's notebook. But,
Submit to
it
the
seems
Ezo.
like, yeah, send poems.
Oh, who said that? I think it's outside.
So, yeah, it makes it hard to figure out where you fit in to this evolving landscape because, I like to think that a lot of my stuff over the years, even from the year before, the year before that, is different from what I'm writing now. So in my head, I am evolving a bit, but then I read some stuff online and I'm just like, should I even bother submitting here? It's I find a few places and a lot of them tend to be the ones that take darker stuff because I write a lot of dark stuff.
Yeah.
And it works. I could probably remember the last 5 journals I've been in. Only Magazine, um, Hobo Camp Review, uh, Aurora, Fevers of the Mind. Just took 5 of mine. They were Kristen Hirsch inspired poems.
Nice.
And what was the other one? Probably the last Edison Literary Review,
Okay.
because they just did their last collection recently, and they took one of my poems. They've taken stuff from me in the past, and they were all print only. Nice little zine, but Jenna Larkin is in her 80s now, and she probably just doesn't want to have to do all that reading anymore. But she took a poem of mine called Seven, which was ended up in my uh, chapbook Woodvale, the Taylor Swift inspired one. It's inspired by the album Folklore.
Okay. That's awesome. I'm not I'm not like a big Taylor Swift fan, but I will say my wife and I were discussing this. Like if we could get tickets for like fairly cheap, we would go see her concert because she's supposed to be fucking awesome and
Yeah. I
her
mean, if I could get them and afford to get them, I would go. My wife was like, you're going by yourself. But I've
she's
tried with her, it's kind of like, no, no, no. You got to listen to Folklore and Evermore, okay? They're different from all the other stuff. And she's just like,
here's your
I
reading
just
order.
don't like her.
I remember
Like, all
when
right, I'm not going to sell you on this one. So, I mean, I've sold her on certain artists in the past that she was a little sketchy about, one of which is a singer songwriter that I've always liked. Her name is Anna Nalick. Her popular song was Breathe, 3 a.m. It was a pretty popular song. And it's what she's most known for, which is bullshit because she's got so much great stuff. So she played in this small place. And by the end of the show, she's just like, she was really fucking good. I was like, yeah, I told you. And she has probably one of the best voices I've ever heard live. Like, you know, does not need any kind of manipulation. The woman is just a great singer.
yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Um, I man, I haven't been to a concert since before COVID. That makes me sad. I need to change that.
I
I'm
remember the last show I went to before COVID, and I went to like I don't know 3 or 4 after, but the last one before COVID was Berlin, OMD, and the B-52s,
nice.
which was a great show. And Berlin was amazing. I just did not expect Terry Nunn to still sound that good at like 60 whatever she is now.
That's what's your I saw the Rolling Stones um probably I was in high school at the time because it was them and Journey together at Blossom,
Hmm.
and they were in their late 50s or 60s at that point, and they were still
Yeah.
performing like crazy people. like, I could, like I think about how I wake up and get out of bed now. It's nothing like they were given 25 years my senior.
Yeah. I mean, I get up in the morning and I look at the alarm clock and I'm like, no.
Is that related to acute body pain, or is that just a different issue entirely?
It's emotional pain of going to that place.
So when you are what's your writing process like? How do you approach the process? I mean, it seems like you use it as a way to process the world around you, which is awesome, because I think some people have to force themselves to write more. They have to like say, I'm going to write today, and they stare at their page and they think we're going to get a prompt, something, but you're able to kind of
Yeah.
like siphon it out of the air. So what's the sit down like?
I try to have an idea of where I'm going ahead of time. I don't always, but usually I'll just block out everything else. I don't even write with music on or anything.
Ooh,
And
couldn't do that.
I'll just focus exactly on what I'm doing. And it's easier for me when I have a project in mind, but when I'm writing every day and I'm giving myself that little jab in the ribs to do it, prompts help. They help.
Yeah.
But sometimes I'll just see a line or I'll hear a line, kind of like that poem in Currents, Bleak is Our Brand. When Nicole said that to me, and I was just like, I can do something with that. A lot of times that happens. Like I'll hear something or read something, and I'll be like, I can make a poem out of that. And it's just, and music too. Music is a big, big deal. Um, Another of my favorite bands is Churches. And Lauren Mayberry just put out her first solo song. And there is a line in there that there's several lines in there that to me are already fodder for, poems. But there is one that just hit me for some reason. It was like, please give me a sign, give me give me a Hollywood line. And I was like, hmm. So the wheels are turning right ahead.
Yeah.
And it just usually will snowball from there.
Yeah. Yeah. When you're how do you get to the point where you're like, I'm done? Like you get through the editing process and you look at it, and is it because I think about this a lot, and this is a question I want to ask more and more people, because I want to know how what point are they either satisfied or they cut and run, because those are two very different things, but they have the same conclusion.
Well, it's like two separate things for me. I know I'm done with the poem at a certain point. Another poet friend of mine, Damian Rucci, always likes to tell me that, my endings are always like hard hitting. Like I always nail like that those final lines in a poem. And that's what I want to do every time. And if I'm looking at the poem later and I'm editing or doing revisions and I'm not coming up, it doesn't look right, then that thing might just sit on a shelf because it didn't end right, or there's something wrong with the flow. Sometimes start end two most important things for me, because once if I start it strong, then the rest of it's going to come together. So it's usually not a problem in the middle.
Okay. Yeah. I I feel like I have the exact opposite problem, that I usually want to do something in the middle that changes the poem somehow. And I spend a lot of time trying to focus on that. And if I feel like I didn't manage that, then I try to stick a landing on the ending. And if I fail both of those things, then I stick it into a drawer and maybe never touch it again, or I look at it like 6 months,
Yeah,
you know.
I mean, I'm sure there's same for you, like it is with me. There's stuff that I've written that, yeah, I wrote that. I don't think I'm ever going to do anything with it. I don't think it's something that either A belongs somewhere, or B is anything anybody's going to relate to or give a shit about. So, you know, and for me, the biggest thing is connection with the reader. I want what I'm writing to resound with whoever's reading it. Otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah. Yeah. I was recently, very recently, having a conversation with somebody, and they were saying like, well, screw the reader. They had a very poet centered attitude about the writing, and
Mm.
it's a poet that I like their poetry. I think um I don't think it's inaccessible writing, but I did ask them. I was like, how much work do you do? I do think it can be tougher in parts, but I don't think it's inaccessible. I just think that it doesn't have a lot of give in terms of like interpretation, and like if I can't get into it, I just feel like there's a wall there. And so I asked them. I said, what for you? How much are you trying to reach out to the reader? And they just looked at me. They're like, I don't try to reach out to the reader. Like, like the reader. Like, because I don't, if they don't understand what I'm trying to do, that doesn't mean anything to me. And I don't know if I agree with that, because I think that's like a super extreme take on it. Because I think
Mm.
if you don't reach out to the readers some, then you're not going to have readers.
Yeah, you're not going to have an audience, or maybe a small core of people who'd be like, the only ones who get it.
Yeah.
And then you're never going to reach anybody else. That, to me, that's the same as hearing some poets say, "Oh, I don't read anybody else. I don't read any other poetry."
Right. Oh, yeah. That's
I just want to be like,
I call that the emaciated athlete. I view that as like somebody who does none of the practices but shows up to every game. Like that's how I view that. And I sometimes I use that as a screening test. Like if I'm at an event and it's not a writing event, and someone starts like the writing talk where they're like, "Oh, hey, I heard you do this," or like, or like, they'll ask what I do, and if I say like I'm a writer, they're like, "Oh, what have you written?" And then they invariably start talking about the book they want to do, or the book they've had in their mind forever, or whatever, and they start having that conversation. Or they're like, "Well, I'm a writer too," and they have like some memoir projects or whatever. And my first screening question is, what do you read? Because if they say nothing, then my goal is to kind of change the subject or shut down that conversation. Not because I don't want to talk to that person specifically, but I don't. know if you can have a serious conversation with somebody that does like you can't really, you know, play if you're a professional athlete, you can't play basketball with somebody who just does pickup games.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying I'm a professional athlete in the world of poetry, but there's a certain amount of seriousness though that I appreciate. It's not about ability or talent or any of that other ego driven shit. I just want to know that when I'm talking to somebody that they take it seriously and they spend time on it and they are trying to get better actively. And reading is like the bare minimum of that.
Oh yeah. I mean, you should want to get better all the time. I mean, I think it's always going to be a learning process until, until I'm worm food. It's just, it's just the way it's going to be because there's always more to learn. There's always more to grow in your craft. And if you're, belligerent about any kind of critique or anything like that, then okay, then you're writing for yourself.
Yeah. Which there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not the approach that I would take per se.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with like if you get something out of writing and it's
Yeah.
not a refined process and you're just writing to feel better and it makes you feel better, then that's awesome. But I don't know.
It should be, a little bit more. I mean, if you truly love to do it, then, you know, I think others will see that in your work, or you should want others to see that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's all relative to what your goals are. Maybe your goal isn't to really have an audience, or maybe like you want to do it and you want to publish a book every 10 years or every 5 years because you're like, or maybe you don't give a shit about publishing books, which is, I've met a lot of really awesome writers who don't really publish books, but they do performances or they have other ways of expressing themselves that, you know, satisfies whatever urgency they feel.
True. Our mutual friend, I would rib him all the time. When are you going to put out a book? When are you going to put out a book? I'm working on it. I'm like, come on, Chad. You can do this.
Chad's very careful. I love Chad to death, and he's a great writer, and he's a yeah. But when he does put out stuff, it's quality. It's really good.
Definitely.
Um, how would you say you've changed over time?
What, as a writer in general, or just
Yeah, like if you were talking about like looking back, or, I don't remember if this recording or before the recording, but we were talking about like you working on the press and the reading series and all that and evolving as a person. Um, and like if you look back, say like 10 years, what do you see in yourself then versus now?
um I can be very disconnected from stuff that I've written a while ago. So I think from then to now, I can probably see just that I'm a little bit more open to trying different things.
Hmm.
I think initially I was a little bit more rigid about how I did my stuff. It's kind of like this is the way it is. And the time that I spent in the poetry group kind of helped the critique group because we challenge ourselves to do things, write in different forms and whatnot. And like one time we did formal poetry, and I was like, and I ended up getting Sestina. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to kill myself. And then I was trying to write this thing, and I was like, I want to die. And, it there was a lot of me sitting at my laptop like this. And my wife would come in and be like, "What's wrong?" I'm like, "I'm never going to do this." But I did it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't bad. And then my friend Anna, who is in the group, who writes formal poetry and writes formal metrical poetry as well,
Mm.
took it and made it metrical because there's no way I was going to be able to, get it the way she did it. But, it ended up getting published. So there's that.
Well, that's good.
So I mean, I think being able to push your own limitations is a good thing. So I guess in a sense, change can be not too bad.
He said with no strain in his voice whatsoever. Is there anything that you want people to know about Kendall before we wrap up?
um, I guess that, for as long as I write, well, I'm gonna be, trying to make that connection with people, and that hopefully what I'm doing will resound with some people. It might not with everybody, but I'm hoping that whoever decides to buy any of my chapbooks or books, picks it up and is left feeling something other than disgust. But
You have a really high bar you set, you know.
and low expectations, little disappointment.
Read it cover to cover, no acid reflux at any point.
Right. But I will send you some Prilosec if you need it.
That's just the kind of poet you are.
Yeah, I might have resting bitch face a lot, but I'm really not so bad.
I've always known you to be warm and kind.
It's kind of like when I do the readings for the series I host, the Poetry Tempest. It's people get afraid to do the open mic session. I'm just kind of like, nobody here is judging you. I'm not judging you. Nobody else here is going to judge you. So go up and do your thing. You're not going to get booed. We're not going to throw empty coffee cups at you or anything. You're good.
Yeah.
The girl I used to work with started coming to the readings, and she was all nervous about finally going up there and reading, and she did, and she was fine. And then she's just kind of like, I kind of want to do it more. So she kept coming and reading in open mics. I was like, this is what I want to see. This is what I want to see from people. And it's kind of like with, even if you're, mostly a reader of poetry and at some point you want to write something, do it.
Hmm. Yeah.
Just do it. And it might not be the greatest thing ever the first time or the second time, but it came out of you. And the more you read, the more you relate with other poets, the more you're going to be able to really know how to express yourself.
Absolutely.
Doesn't happen overnight, but when does it ever?
Only when I wet the bed. That's
Yeah, yeah. Only when I'm at work, slamming blender jars and stuff.
sticking your head in the blender.
I've thought of it.
Now, I can attest to how good that feeling feels. I had for this workshop I've been doing for a long time. Started in 2015, and this woman has been going every single month, and her husband would go with her, and he would sit in the corner, like he would go to drop her off, like they'd drive together, they enjoyed driving together, and they were older, probably in their 70s when they first started coming, but he would just sit in the corner, and he did that every month for like 4 or 5 years. He would show up and then just read in the corner. And eventually she convinced him to write a poem. And he brought it, and he didn't read it the first month. He brought it back. And then the second month he brought it again, and he didn't read it then either. And by the time he had brought it the third month, he had written like 4 poems. And so he finally read the first poem. And then after that, he was hooked. He started writing. And it was that he didn't start writing poetry until his late 70s. And he wound up
Wow.
writing a decent amount and started sharing regularly with the group. And when that happened, he opened up, not just like on the page, but with people, you know. Obviously it's different when you're not like reading in a corner. So, but at the
Yeah.
same time, people found him accessible. And I thought that was, I mean, well, he often said like, you know, this is nice. I'm glad I started writing. So
I mean, I'm not going to lie, especially at readings, the stuff that people tend to really connect with are the stuff that's the most relatable, I mean, stuff that, they feel they might have experienced themselves, so, and if a lot of that's personal, that's fine. There's definitely, I would consider a lot of what I write, whether it's fact or fiction, to be closer to confessional than anything else. And even when I think of some of my favorite poets, a lot of their stuff is very, very open.
yeah, yeah. I think I think over time I've made, to some extent I've made this deliberately, but I think it just was a natural progression. I do think that my poetry has gotten stronger over time, but less technically challenging. And I'm not really interested. You know, when I first left my MFA, I was interested in like having a clever poetry. I guess is the best way to put it. Like I want to like seem smart on the page, but
I
that's
think
not
that's a
really.
byproduct of the MFA system.
I think so too.
Really.
I think so too. I was talking to Ciara Freeman, and we had a long conversation about the MFA mindset, and she was saying that she likes when she's doing literary magazine because she's an editor for one. She likes taking all the post MFA stuff, like people that are straight out of their program, because she really likes kind of like trying to pick apart, you know, whatever the heck they're working on, but at the same time it's like quaint in a sense, like it's this, like it's I don't want to say completely ego driven, but there is an ego driven aspect to it that when you can leave that behind, it one makes you more open to writing about truthful things, I think, because you're not trying to make it, you're allowing yourself to be more open without causing confusion or chaos in front of the vulnerability, in a sense that like allows you to get some distance from it. um but it also, so I think it makes the writer more human. I don't know, have you
Absolutely.
ever read like for Stephen King's Dark Tower series?
No.
His very first book, you can see, because he wrote that series over the course of his lifetime. Like there's a whole bunch of books, but he didn't finish it until after he had been hit by the ban. So he his first book he wrote right after he was just got out of college, and it is technically challenging, and I think it's by far the weakest writing out of the bunch. And I also would point to Billy Collins. He was a very successful poet, and I'm not saying that success is what a poet should chase necessarily, but his writing was accessible. And I think MFA students have a tendency to want to beat up on him or think that he's not worth studying because of the simplicity. And I don't think he's got like Hemingway asked like level quality for the simplicity that he gives, but I also think he's a very extremely strong poet. And I think that he's overlooked because he's less challenging by academic people, but that perhaps maybe they shouldn't do that.
No, I don't think they should. I mean, I would say that he's not necessarily my bag, but, you know, there's nothing wrong with accessibility. I mean, because Same with Mary Oliver. People want to peg her as somebody who's this, oh, she's just this nature poet, blah, 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 blah. That's because you didn't bother to dig a little deeper.
Mm. Yeah, I'm a huge
Because
fan.
Mary Oliver stuff is actually really great.
Yeah.
And you want to go further back, Emily Dickinson, you know, I a lot of times I like to say that dead poets have nothing left to offer because they're dead, but it's not entirely true. It's not entirely true.
And a more objective statement might be they have nothing new to offer.
Yeah, but like you said though, simplicity isn't necessarily a bad thing. Unless you're an instant poet.
Yeah, right. All right. Well, do you have anything that you want to say before we sign off?
I don't think so. I guess, it'd be great if, people saw this and decided, maybe I want to read his stuff because, he doesn't seem like too much of a douchebag. I mean, that'd be great.
Well, you heard it here, folks. Read Kendall A. Bell's collection, Currents, and anything else he writes, because he is not a douchebag.
I think Currents is if that's the starting point for anybody, then I think it's a good start because it's a collection that I'm proud of. It's a collection that I was really happy that you know your press wanted to put out, particularly one that was like the opening one. It's like,
Yeah, it was our first book. It was the
yeah,
first book we published, and
that's never happened to me before. So that's pretty cool. You know, and a lot of my stuff is like that. It's the human condition. We're all stuck on this freaking mud ball. So spend less time judging and more time relating, and doesn't cost a freaking dime to be kind.
right, and that's the thing. It's so easy to just not be a douchebag. I think uh, I do want to say, and this is my actual much harder, better pitch for reading Currents. We sat down. I remember sitting down with a couple of the editors, and we went to look at your collection. And I had written up a series of questions to kind of like just to keep ourselves on track and kind of keep us moving through the editing process. And one of them was, should we remove or ask for more poems to be added so we can like sort through. And I read the question, and one of the editors looks down, kind of confused, looks up and goes, "Why? This is great. Like the whole thing's cohesive. We don't need more or less. This is fine right here." And it was just it's a really strong collection. I think it's nuanced, and I think it's got the darkness that you lean into sometimes. I don't think it goes too heavy into that, and I think it contrasts it with other things, with other elements really well. So thank you for writing. Thank you for writing so prolifically, and for publishing through us and taking this time today.
Well, thank you for having me in both senses because it's validating, to hear stuff like that. When you can hear that editors looked at it and said, this is great the way it is. It's like, well, shit, I did something pretty good then.
I think you did, and I think other
And
people.
I'm not usually the pat on my own back type of person, but it that the validation almost makes me want to say, hey, maybe I deserve that pat today.
I think you do, and I think that you should make time to pat yourself on the back more often. I encourage it. If my encouragement means anything, but I
I
encourage
will try to remember that.
you. Please do. All right. All right. Well, thank you again. And yeah, bye currents, everyone.
Thanks for having me.